Ghosts of Covent Garden, Bloomsbury and the Strand. The Adelphi Theatre, Strand. The late Ella Terrace, Lady Hicks, first told me about the Adelphi Theatre ghost, for she was the daughter of William Terrace, the actor-manager who was stabbed to death on December 16th, 1897, at the doorway in Maiden Lane, and his ghost haunted the theatre and a nearby underground station for years afterwards, and perhaps still does. William Terrace had been a sheep farmer in the Falkland Islands, where Ella Lane was born, and he had been a horse breeder, a gold miner, a sailor, before becoming an actor. He had great success on the stage, and was scoring in considerable triumph as the vigorous lead in the thriller Secret Service, in which an ambitious and jealous man named Richard Prince had a very small part. Prince really believed that he could play the lead better than the experienced and popular Terrace, and furthermore, he thought he would be given the part if only Terrace was not in the way. That chill December evening, William Terrace dined early with a friend, and at 7 o'clock he made his way into ill-lit Maiden Lane. He was just opening his private door at the back of the theatre when Richard Prince sprang at him from out of the shadows and without a word stabbed Terrace twice with a dagger he had bought that afternoon, and the 49-year-old actor slumped to the ground, fatally wounded. He was carried into the theatre and died 20 minutes later, his head supported by his distraught leading lady, Jessie Millward. Those who were with him at the end say that just before he died, he mumbled something that sounded like, "I will come back." Ella Lyne's husband, Sir Seymour Hicks, went to Bow Street Police Station to identify Prince, who had been seized in Maiden Lane, and found the murderer screaming and cursing and foaming at the mouth. Back at the Adelphi, Sir Seymour knelt by the dead body of his father-in-law and said afterwards, in utter silence, I heard a voice say to me, "Are there men living such fools as to think there is no hereafter?" And I knew beyond doubt that I would meet William Terrace again. At the subsequent trial, Prince was found guilty of murder, but insane, and he spent the rest of his life in Broadmoor, where he died in 1937 at the age of 71. Soon after the murder, actors and actresses at the Adelphi were disturbed by strange tappings and rappings that seemed to emanate from the dressing room used by William Terrace and his leading lady, and this was just the beginning. Over the succeeding years, unexplained footsteps, the strange behaviour of mechanical sound lifts, odd noises, strange lights, an overwhelming impression of something being present in the deserted theatre at night, especially in the vicinity of the two main dressing rooms, and the feeling of being watched. All these apparently inexplicable impressions and occurrences have been attributed to the ghost of William Terrace, and his ghost has been seen in Maiden Lane. One summer evening in 1957, a visitor to London who knew nothing of William Terrace or the ghost story encountered a tall and handsome figure dressed in old-fashioned clothes, seemingly quite solid and normal in every way, a figure that passed close by, but which disappeared completely at the doorway where Terrace had been struck down. In March 1928, June, the well-known musical comedy actress, was occupying the large dressing room used by Jessie Millward at the time of Terrace's death. Terrace had been in the habit of tapping a couple of times with his stick on the door of his leading lady's dressing room as he passed, a little reminder that he was in the theatre. June usually refreshed herself with a light meal between matinee and evening performances, which she consumed in the very pleasant dressing room with its 3 windows and open fireplace. Afterwards, she often had a nap until about 7 o'clock. On the day in question, she had just settled on the chaise longue for a rest when the couch began to vibrate and lurch. for all the world as though someone was kicking it from underneath, but a careful search revealed nobody under the chaise lounge, and nothing that might account for the peculiar movements. No sooner did she lie down again than the movements recommenced, and she felt a number of light blows on her arm, and then she felt her arm gripped tightly by an invisible hand. Suddenly she noticed a greenish-coloured glow of light hovering in front of the dressing-table mirror. Rising from the couch where she had been trying in vain to rest, she walked towards the dressing-table, watching the luminous glow all the time. Arriving there and still observing the pale green light flickering in front of the mirror, she put out her hand towards the light, whereupon it instantly vanished. But she saw raised wheals on her arm where something had gripped her forearm. After a moment she heard a couple of taps that seemed to come from behind the mirror, and then there was silence. When June's dresser, Ethel Rowling, arrived, June related her experiences, and then heard for the first time about strange happenings at the theatre. Time after time, the dresser said, just after June had gone on stage, a couple of raps would sound at the door, but when she opened it, there was never anyone there. During the course of a séance held in the dressing room, at which psychic investigator Harry Price was present, nothing of real interest happened, but no strange lights or tapping noises were reported for some months afterwards. 4 years later, when people suggested that the whole affair was a publicity stunt, June reasserted that she had heard the noises, felt the blows on her arm, and seen the strange light, and she was still satisfied that her dresser had answered unexplained knocks at the dressing room door. In 1962, 2 members of the theatre staff saw what might have been a similar light to that seen by June 34 years earlier. It was after everyone else had left the theatre, and the dark stage was lit only by 2 pilot lights. Without warning, one of the stagehands felt uncomfortably cold, although a moment earlier he had felt normally warm, and in looking about him for some explanation for the sudden and extreme drop in temperature, he saw a curious glowing light that seemed to be lit by some kind of inner radiance. Glancing at his companion, he saw that he too was staring at the strange form, which seemed to float just above the stage, and to be shaped something like a human body. The 2 men fled in terror, and next day reported their experience to the manager, asking to be transferred to work away from the front of the stage, but on being told that they had probably seen the long-established and harmless ghost of the famous William Terrace, they agreed to continue working as before. The Albury Theatre, St. Martin's Lane. The Albury Theatre, formerly the New, in St. Martin's Lane, was built by Sir Charles Wyndham, and his ghost, a handsome figure with wavy grey hair, has been seen backstage, crossing the otherwise deserted stage and disappearing in the direction of the dressing room. Film and stage actor Barry Jones told me that he was talking to an actress at the New during a break in rehearsal, and they both moved aside to allow a grey-haired man to pass them. He nodded an acknowledgement as he went by, and then crossed the stage and disappeared from view towards the dressing rooms. His distinguished appearance intrigued Jones, and after a moment he too crossed the stage and asked the attendant who was standing beside a door through which the man must have passed which way the man had gone, but the attendant said no one had passed him for some time, and he'd never seen anyone answering Jones's description in the theatre. Suddenly, Barry Jones realised that the figure he and his fellow actor had seen was Sir Charles Wyndham, who had also built the theatre that backs on the Albury and which bears his name. One of the household staff told me in August 1972 that he had 4 times heard noises he could not account for in the vicinity of a small room on the first floor of Aldine House, Bedford Street, when it was occupied by Dents the publishers. The noises, the sounds of heavy breathing, coughing and footsteps were heard over a period of 3 months, and my informant told me that on the last occasion, on Wednesday, August the 16th, 1972, he was so certain, although he saw nothing, that something was there, that he ran away and left the light on in that particular room, fearing what he might encounter if he went inside. The coughing on this occasion sounded very close at hand, almost over his shoulder. He always heard the noises during the early evening, around 6 p.m, when he was touring the building, putting out lights and closing windows. When the housekeeper reprimanded him for leaving a light on, the staff member immediately admitted that he had indeed left the area of the old building very quickly, because he had become frightened after hearing noises that he could not explain. The housekeeper replied that he was not surprised, for other people had noticed mysterious noises on that particular landing, and indeed his wife had, on one occasion, heard such odd sounds that she had become frightened and telephoned her husband on the internal phone from a nearby office, and he had come down at once with a torch and investigated, but nothing was found that might have caused the noise. That time the noise were heard much later at night. The housekeeper also discovered that many years ago a man had committed suicide in the room where the noises seemed to originate. At the time of the disturbances, the building was in the process of changing hands. Perhaps the ghost was worried about what might happen to its habitat. I found it interesting to note that the phenomena seemed to be mounting in intensity. At first, slight noises suggesting someone in the room, then distinct footsteps and louder noises, until on the last occasion they seemed to be outside the room and at the very elbow of the staff member doing his rounds. Furthermore, each person who experienced the noises was certain that someone or something was in the room as they reached the corridor leading to the room. On the occasions that the noises were heard, they somehow sensed that there was something there before they heard anything, although on scores of other occasions they found the area quite normal in every respect. I tried to discover more about the suicide, whether it had taken place in the evening, which is most probable, and whether it had occurred during the summer months when the noises were heard, but I was unsuccessful. And now, since the building is likely to be completely altered, London has probably lost yet another of its ghosts. The British Museum, Bloomsbury. One of the most interesting cases of haunting in London is or was associated with the mummy cases of a high priestess of the temple of Amun-Ra. Perhaps the best way of presenting the story is to relate that somewhat differing accounts told to me by the various people concerned. It does seem indisputable that from the time the mummy case passed into the possession of an Englishman in Egypt, about 1860, a strange series of fatalities followed its journey, and even when it resided in the mummy room at the British Museum, sudden death haunted those who handled the 3,500-year-old relic from Luxor. Count Louis Hamon, Giro, the palmist and astrologer, used to relate that he once read the hands of a young man named Douglas Murray, and that as soon as he took his visitor's right hand, he experienced a feeling of dread and terror. He felt that the arm would not long remain attached to its owner. In addition, Giro saw the hand draw a prize of some kind, and said that from the moment a series of misfortunes would commence, and soon afterwards, Murray would lose his arm. A few years later, the same man revisited Giro with the empty sleeve of his right arm fastened across the front of his coat. He said he had been in Egypt with his 2 friends, and while in Cairo, a man showed him a finely preserved mummy case, the hieroglyphics describing its ancient owner as a high priestess of Amun-Ra. The enigmatic features of the young princess were beautifully worked in enamel and gold on the outside of the case. When his friends heard of the wonderful find, they each wanted to buy the mummy case, and eventually it was agreed that the three friends would draw lots for the opportunity of bargaining for it. Douglas Murray won. On the same evening, he completed arrangements for the purchase of the mummy case and for its package and dispatch to London. A few days later, duck shooting on the Nile, Murray's shotgun exploded and shattered his right arm. In an attempt to hurry back to Cairo, he was hindered by tremendous headwinds, and it was 10 days before he obtained expert medical attention. By then, gangrene had set in, and the arm had to be amputated. On the return journey to England, both Murray's companions died and were buried at sea. Back in London, and feeling far from well himself, Murray found the mummy case unpacked and waiting for him in the hall of his home. There was something ominous about it. The face he had thought so young and beautiful now seemed old and full of malevolence. And when a reporter asked to borrow the mummy case, in connection with an interview she was writing on Douglas Murray, he found that he was glad to know that the case was leaving his home. Misfortune seems to have struck the unfortunate journalist. As soon as the mummy case entered her home, her mother fell downstairs and died as a result. Her fiancé ended their engagement. Her prized dogs went mad, and she herself became ill. Her lawyer, with whom she had been preparing her will, decided that the mummy case was worrying her, and he had it returned to Douglas Murray, who decided to give it to the British Museum. Still not feeling his old self, Murray obtained the services of a friend to make the necessary arrangements with the museum authorities, and this man, himself an ardent Egyptologist, had the mummy case sent to his home, where he studied the hieroglyphics. Within weeks, the man was found dead. His servant said that his master had been unable to sleep ever since the mummy case had arrived at the house. Eventually, the mummy case went to the British Museum, and before long stories began to circulate that something unfortunate always happened to anyone who tried to take photographs or sketch the mummy case. Chiro claimed that the British Museum authorities removed the mummy case from public exhibition and presented it to a museum in New York, and that it disappeared when the unsinkable Titanic sank on her maiden voyage across the Atlantic. Stuart Martin, a novelist and journalist, studied the case and stated that in addition to the incidents recounted by Chiro, Douglas Murray lost a large part of his fortune soon after the mummy case came into his possession, and that when the case was being photographed at the studio, the photographer was puzzled and perplexed by the entirely different face that appeared on his photograph, a woman's face with hatred and spite in every line. The photographer died soon afterwards, said Martin. When the mummy case was sent to the British Museum, the carrier who transported the case died a week later, but Martin maintained that once the mummy case was at the British Museum, residing among other embalmed bodies, the mummy cases of Egyptian nobility, no more disturbances occurred. The ghost hunter Thurston Hopkins told me that he was convinced that at least 13 people who handled the haunted mummy case met with sudden death or disaster. He said that a press photographer had taken a photograph of the mummy case at the British Museum and had returned the next day to Sir Ernest Wallace Budge, keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities in the British Museum, for 30 years, with the photograph, which showed another woman's face, so horrid and frightening that after leaving the museum, the photographer went home and shot himself. Hopkins always maintained that Wallace Budge, perhaps the most learned Egyptologist of modern times, was continually worried by reports from his staff about unexplained hammering noises and the sound of sobbing coming from the case containing the mummy. He said the case had an extremely lurid record, and wondering whether the priestess was not satisfied with her position and presentation, arranged for the mummy case to have a showcase to itself and a large ticket with a laudatory notice. Thereafter, the mummy case was quiet. Thurston Hopkins told me he had once interviewed a keeper in the mummy room who maintained that at dusk one evening he had seen a figure suddenly sit up in the empty bottom half of the mummy case of Amun-Ra, and something with a horrible yellow face glided towards him with a sickeningly smooth movement, until he thought he was going to be pushed down a trapdoor. He sprang forward to protect himself, only to find that his face and hands meant nothing, and the figure or form that he had seen had disappeared. Kay Thomas, the daughter of a British Museum official, told Thurston Hopkins some of the many stories her father had related to her about curious happenings in the vicinity of the mummy case. Most of the museum cleaners seemed to have been scared of some intangible influence, and when one treated the case containing the relic disdainfully, his son died soon afterwards. Several museum workers were injured when the mummy case was being set in position, and most of the men firmly believed that she exerted a harmful influence. Eventually the case was relegated to the basement. During the removal, one man suffered a sprained ankle, and within a week, one of the section chiefs died at his desk at the museum. Wentworth Day told me that Budge believed that the man who found the mummy fell dead in the tomb as soon as his hand touched the folds of bandages that had covered the mummy for over 3,000 years. He said that when the mummy case was photographed, one photographer died suddenly and another smashed his film, and his son was badly caught in an accident. Even a photographer's assistant fell while adjusting the camera and cut his face. When a photograph was at length obtained, it showed a livid and ominous woman's face, full of menace and evil. A later owner no sooner had it in her home than every piece of glass in the house shattered. Fascinating as several of these stories are, there is some doubt as to their authenticity. Archaeologist Margaret Murray was nearly 100 years old when I talked to her about the haunted mummy case. She told me she had rather a fondness for the old wooden coffin lid, with its beautifully painted scenes, but she always used to refer to its evil reputation when taking her students round the exhibits of the British Museum, and invariably some would refuse to enter the room containing the mummy case. Margaret Murray maintained that she originated much of the reputed history of the mummy case during the course of an interview which she did not take seriously. She was astonished to find the story retold as fact in later years, but the story, in one form or another, still crops up from time to time. It is a part of haunted London, and occasionally, even today, visitors to the mummy room at the British Museum maintain that they have odd sensations when they look too long or too hard at the mummy case of Princess Amun-Ra exhibit 22542. Case 35. In fact, the whole story seems to rest on a series of misunderstandings. As the keeper of the Department of Egyptian Antiquities told me in December 1972, Mr. Douglas Murray and Mr. W.T. Stead stated that they had knowledge of an Egyptian mummy that had been brought to England by a lady and placed in her drawing room. Next morning, everything that was breakable in the room was found smashed to pieces. When the mummy was moved to another room, the same thing happened. The lady's husband then took the object to the top of the house and locked it in the cupboard. That night, sounds of heavy footsteps trampled up and down the stairs all night, and forms transported heavy articles from the upper floors to the ground floor. Strange lights flickered up and down the stairway, accompanying the forms that shook the staircase with their weight or power. Next day, all the servants resigned in a body. It was about this time, 1889, that Mr. A.F. Wheeler, presented to the British Museum a very handsome inner cover from a mummy case of a great lady, a princess of Ammon, and a member of the College of Ammon-Ra at Thebes. This valuable object was accepted by the museum authorities and placed on exhibition in the first Egyptian room, where it remained until 1920. Mr. Douglas Murray and Mr. W.T. Stead studied the coffin lid and felt that the expression on the face of the cover was that of a living soul in torment, and they tried to obtain permission to hold a séance in the Egyptian room with the object of bringing relief to the entity concerned. Their views and opinions were published in many newspapers, and readers recalled the mummy that was said to smash crockery and furniture, and gradually the coffin lid in the British Museum became associated with the disturbances, a new and curious incident being added with each publication of the story. Later, the story gained a fresh lease of life with reports that the museum authorities were receiving so many complaints about the dire effects of the coffin lid on showing the Egyptian room that it had to be moved to the basement. It was claimed that several members of the museum staff had died as a result of handling the coffin lid, and that Sir Wallace Budge had been instructed to negotiate the sale of the terrible object to a wealthy American. The cover was said to have been shipped on the Titanic, causing the ship to strike an iceberg, but bribery had saved the lid from being lost. In America, calamities and ill fortune followed in the wake of the coffin lid, and it was then sold to a Canadian who took it to Montreal, where it continued to cause misfortune for everyone who came into contact with it, until the owner decided to send it back to England on the Empress of Ireland, which sank in the St. Lawrence River, taking with it the Egyptian coffin lid. In 1934, Sir Wallace Budge felt it necessary to announce that the British Museum never possessed mummy, coffin or cover that had any of the reputed attributes. The trustees never gave any order for the removal of the cover, Exhibit 22542, to the basement, although during air raids in the 1914-18 war, it was moved to a place of safety. The British Museum trustees have no power to sell any object in their charge, still less has a keeper the right to dispose of anything, whatever the circumstances. Finally, Sir Wallace stated categorically, "I did not sell the cover to an American. The cover never went on the Titanic. It never went to America. It was not sold to anyone in Canada, and it is still in the first Egyptian room at the British Museum." Later, the coffin lid was moved to the second Egyptian room, where it still resides, an object of speculation and wonder to many visitors, if not to the museum authorities. Sir Wallace Budge, 1857 to 1934, translated the famous Egyptian Book of the Dead, considered to be of divine origin, having been written entirely for the dead by the god Thoth. It is filled with spells and incantations for the preservation of the mummy and for everlasting life. Budge, in private, if not in public, certainly believed in ancient Egyptian magic and the power of their dead. He has been quoted as saying, "Never print what I say in my lifetime, but the mummy case of Princess Ammon-Ra caused the war," an enigmatic statement that he refused to enlarge upon. Today the coffin lid is labelled "Mummy cover from the coffin of an unknown princess from Thebes, 21st dynasty, about 1050 BC, presented by A.F. Wheeler, 1889. The Coliseum Theatre, St. Martin's Lane. The Coliseum used to have a soldier ghost that dated from the 1914-18 war. The uniformed figure used to walk down the dress circle gangway and turn into the second row just before the lights were lowered for a performance to begin. The figure was recognised as a soldier who spent his last evening on leave at the theatre, and the ghost was first seen on October 3rd, 1918, the date that the soldier was killed in action. In November 1955, following reports that the ghost of William Terrace had been seen there, I talked with several of the station staff and learned that peculiar happenings had been experienced in the immediate area of the station for some time. For the previous 3 years, engineers and gangers working on the line had complained of a ghostly figure in one of the tunnels after the station was cleared at night. There were echoing footsteps, occasional sighs, gasps, and loud banging noises, which the workmen, long used to working in isolated conditions underground, had never previously experienced. I talked with a foreman ticket collector, Jack Hayden, who had been at the station for 9 years. He told me that one night, after he had locked all the gates of the station and was making a final check, that the platforms were deserted, he suddenly noticed a tall and distinguished-looking man walking along the westbound subway and climbing the emergency spiral stairs. Hayden quickly telephoned upstairs and told the booking office clerk to apprehend the man coming up the stairs. Hayden himself took the lift up and met a puzzled clerk who said no one had emerged from the stairs. Together the two men searched the spiral stairs from top to bottom and all parts of the station, but there was no sign of the mysterious stranger. A few days later, Hayden was having a meal around midnight in the staff mess room at the station, which is just below ground level. The last train had gone, and Hayden knew that the station was deserted. Yet suddenly a door opened, and he saw the same tall man standing, looking at him. This time he noticed the old-fashioned cut of the man's grey suit, his old-style shirt collar, and his light-coloured gloves. Thinking that some passenger must have lost his way, Hayden asked the man what he wanted, but instead of answering, the figure moved out of view. Hayden quickly moved through a communicating door that gave him an uninterrupted view of the hall passage where the figure had stood, but there was no sight or sound of the man he had seen. 4 days later, at midday, he and Rose Ring, a station worker, were in the mess room together when they both heard a loud scream, and the next moment Victor Locker, a 19-year-old porter, burst into the room gasping that he had seen a strange-looking man standing in the corner of the next room, and when he had moved towards the figure to ask what he was doing, he had experienced the feeling of something pressing down heavily on his head, and the man had vanished in front of his eyes. Subsequently, Locker added that the man he saw was wearing funny-looking clothes and pale gloves. When Jack Hayden described the figure he had twice seen, the porter agreed that it was the same figure that had frightened him. Locker asked for a transfer and left Covent Garden station shortly afterwards. Subsequently, Eric Davey, a foreman at Leicester Square station, told me he was satisfied that there was something strange at Covent Garden station. He was clairvoyant and had been aware on several occasions of an unseen presence in the mess room there. Furthermore, he believed that the spirit was trying to give a name sounding something like Terry. When Hayden was shown a photograph of William Terrace, he immediately stated that Terrace was the man he had seen. William Terrace always wore light-coloured gloves. Over the next 10 years, the ghost was seen more than a dozen times, and when Hayden left the station in 1965, he said the apparition inevitably appeared during the November and December and always looked exactly the same. It usually appeared near a wall. He spoke to it several times, but it never answered. The last time he saw it, late one November night in 1964, he was walking down the spiral stairway when he encountered the ghost walking up the same stairs. He hurried past the silent figure that did not seem to notice him and almost fell down the last few steps. But the knocks, the footsteps, and the feeling that he might see the figure at any time was all becoming too much of a strain, and so he asked for a transfer and left the station. However, the ghost still walked, and inexplicable footsteps have been reported on many occasions, especially on Sundays, when the station is closed to the public. Usually the footsteps seem to come from just within the tunnel that runs from Covent Garden to Holborn. The figure of William Terrace, if William Terrace it is, was seen several times by a signalman, a station master, an engineer, and other workers in March 1972. Small wonder that some of the station staff at Covent Garden refused to use the mess room there. The Duke of York Theatre, St Martin's Lane. Although the Duke of York Theatre in St Martin's Lane has no resident ghost that I know of, it was the scene of some very odd experiences a few years ago, when a certain costume jacket became known as the Strangler jacket. An actress, Flora Hurd, was among those who were affected by wearing it. In 1948, Flora Hurd was leading lady in A Queen Came By, a play set in the days of Queen Victoria's Jubilee. Part of her costume was an old, short-backed, Holero-style jacket that had been made some 55 years earlier. Although there seemed ample room in the jacket, and the size was right, Flora Hurd found that it produced an unpleasant tightness about her arms and chest. She said nothing at first, but began to detest the coat, which seemed tighter every time she wore it. One night, Flora Hurd was unable to appear, and her understudy, Erica Foyle, took over the part, and for the first time wore the jacket. She experienced exactly the same tight, unpleasant sensations, although she knew nothing of Flora Hurd's impressions. That night, Erica Foyle saw the apparition of a young woman wearing the tight-fitting jacket. Erica Foyle told her experiences to the stage manager, Marjorie Page, and when Flora Hurd related feeling similar sensations, Marjorie Page tried the jacket on herself and found that it affected her in the same way. Mrs. Frederick Pifford, wife of the play's director, tried on the coat with no ill effect until she removed it, and those present pointed in horror at a series of red wheals that had appeared on Mrs. Pifford's throat, marks that might have been expected after an attempt at strangulation. During the course of a séance held at the theatre, a medium described a vision in which a young girl provoked insane jealousy and anger in a man who attacked the girl, tearing her clothes until the girl fell backwards and she was forced into a barrel of water until she drowned. The man then dragged her body up a flight of stairs, where he wrapped the body in a blanket and carried it down the stairs again, wet and dripping with water. Here the visions faded. At this point, Marjorie Page, who was watching the proceedings, exclaimed with some excitement that she had seen a very similar vision at the time she had worn the jacket, but it had seemed so fantastic that she had said nothing about it at the time. A little later, a man tried on the coat and promptly fainted. A younger man took a turn and immediately seemed to have difficulty with his breathing. The subsequent history of the jacket is interesting. It seems to have become the property of a man named Lloyd, who lived in Los Angeles, and within minutes of wearing the jacket, his wife felt totally exhausted, almost as though she was being strangled or drowned. She complained of a feeling of suffocation of the lungs and an oppressive weight on her legs. A 16-year-old girl felt as though fingers were plucking at her throat when she wore the coat. Another woman who tried it on said it felt as heavy as armour and it hurt her, and a third woman hurriedly removed it after 3 minutes, saying it seemed to choke her. The mental condition of those wearing the jacket and knowing something of the story associated with it may be the cause of the impressions received by the later wearers of the Strangler jacket. But what about the initial reaction of Flora Hurd and her understudy? The origin of the jacket is obscure. There is some evidence that it was originally made for an early production of Charlie's Aunt and was stored at a theatrical costumer's for nearly 50 years. but other people maintain that it was picked up from an old clothes stall in a London market. What is indisputable is that the coat is a piece of Victoriana, and it was worn by a young woman in a play concerning Queen Victoria. Perhaps the combination of these facts and circumstances sparked off some kind of psychic energy. Gower Street, Bloomsbury. A tea shop that used to stand at the north end of Gower Street, before the modernisation of the road junction there, was said to be haunted by the ghost of a man with a bandaged head, a man who vanished whenever a waitress approached him for his order. The restaurant used to be frequented by medical students from nearby University College Hospital, but the immediate and quite inexplicable disappearance of the figure, which always occupied the same table, seems to invalidate the popular explanation that medical students were playing practical jokes. It seems more likely that it was the same ghost that haunted a boarding house in Gower Street a few years earlier. The trouble began when a young lady lodger was awakened one night by a loud noise, and standing up in bed, she was terrified to see the head and shoulders of a man, swathed in bandages. The form, which seemed to have a luminosity of its own, appeared in an alcove of the room usually occupied by a bookcase, which had been torn from its fastenings and lay broken on the floor, a probable cause of the noise that had awakened the terrified girl. A few days later, loud knocks were reported by several people in the house, and the following week the figure with bandaged head was seen again. Later more rappings were heard, and thereafter the disturbances seemed to cease. No explanation was ever discovered for either the distinct rapping or the singular apparition. King Street, Covent Garden. An old house in King Street, Covent Garden, has long been regarded as haunted, and may be the one in which a handsome woman, but common, saw her friend, the son of Lord Mohun, after he had been killed. John Aubrey records that in the 17th century the gallant young son and heir of Lord Mohun had a quarrel with a Prince Griffin, and it was arranged that a duel should be fought on Chelsea fields, on horseback with swords. On his way to the rendezvous, Mohun was stopped by a party of men who picked a quarrel with him and shot him dead. It was commonly believed that the whole thing was organised by Prince Griffin, who knew Mohun would be the better horseman than himself. The murder took place at 10 o'clock in the morning, and on the same day and at the same time this handsome but common lady friend in King Street saw the figure of young Mohun at her bedside. He drew the curtains aside, looked in on her, and then disappeared. She called out to him and then to her maid, who did not see the figure, but the door of the room was locked and the maid had the key in her pocket. Aubrey arranged for a friend to question both the mistress and her servant, and was satisfied that the account was a true one. The same house has so affected some people that nothing would induce them to spend the night there by themselves. A surveyor, during the course of making some specifications of the building, stumbled down some very worn steps in the basement, and found himself in a deep cellar. He knew that a lot of these old houses were built on the site of the old Covent Gardens of Westminster, St. Peter's Abbey, and he thought he would see how far the cellars extended, it having been suggested that some of the cellars connect with one another. The surveyor noticed that the cellar was full of coal, and seeing a shovel close by, he set about moving some of the coal so that he could explore further. But as fast as he moved the coal, it slid or rolled back to where it had been previously. After a while the surveyor gave up and returned upstairs, where he talked to the housekeeper about the cellar and the steps, and was surprised to learn that the old man seemed to have no knowledge of the stock of coal, or of the worn stone steps. Some time later the surveyor had occasion to return to the house to check some measurements, and, descending to the basement, he was amazed to find neither steps nor coal down there. A burly manservant in the house at the time rarely ventured down into the basement because he said he had seen a shadowy appearance of evil down there, and he knew others who felt a bad influence in that part of the house. Once he had fired a revolver at something he saw in the house, but without any visible effect. I understand that the cellars of this particular house have now been sealed, and I could obtain no adequate reason for this action. The Lyceum Theatre, Wellington Street, Strand. The old Lyceum Theatre in Wellington Street off the Strand had a ghostly corpse-like figure that stalked backstage during performances, but it seems to have disappeared since the theatre became a dance hall, its elegant Corinthian portico disfigured with massive poster boards. As the venue of many a beauty contest, more attractive figures now walk backstage. At a meeting of the Ghost Club, W.J. McQueen Pope related a gruesome experience at the richly decorated Lyceum, as it was about 100 years ago. During a performance at the theatre, a man occupying a box with his wife chanced to look down towards the stalls, and there noticed a woman in the fourth row, dressed in beautiful coloured silks, with what looked like a man's head on her lap. The man's wife noticed the direction of his gaze and asked him what on earth the woman had on her lap, adding, "It looks like a man's head." In fact, they both agreed that this pale-faced head, with closed eyes, had long hair, a moustache, and pointed beard, and they both thought it looked like the head of a cavalier. During the interval, the man and his wife, overcome with curiosity, left their box and walked through the stalls of the theatre to obtain a closer look at the strange object. But they were disappointed to discover that any object on the lady's lap was now covered by a silk wrap. At the end of the performance, they tried to intercept the well-groomed lady, who appeared to be unaccompanied, but they lost her in the crowd of theatre-goers leaving the building. Years later, the man, by that time something of an expert in objects d'art, was invited to visit an ancestral hall in Yorkshire to value some paintings. There he saw a portrait of a cavalier, and it was indisputably the man whose head he had seen at the Lyceum. During the course of inquiries, he learned that the portrait was that of an ancestor who had been beheaded by Cromwell, and he further discovered that the family had once owned the ground on which the Lyceum Theatre was built. Metropolitan Music Hall, Edgware Road, demolished. The Metropolitan Music Hall in Edgware Road had a ghost that dated from the First World War. A manager had been killed on active service in France was often seen at early performances dressed in a brown suit and seemingly watching the stage and the attendants with a critical eye. After a while the figure was simply no longer there. It was never seen anywhere in the theatre except seated near the back of the stalls. Red Lion Square, Holborn. A London square that is unique in that it used to be haunted by three ghosts walking together. The square, much altered in recent years for the benefit of motor traffic, was built in 1698 on the Red Lion Fields, where, it was commonly believed, the remains of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, the parliamentarian general who married Cromwell's daughter Bridget, and John Bradshaw, who, as president of the court, pronounced the death sentence on Charles I, were brought from Westminster. The bodies of all three men were disinterred from their tombs in Westminster Abbey after the Restoration, and publicly hanged at Tyburn as an expression of public feeling for their part in the Civil War and the harsh rule afterwards. Although Red Lion Fields was not on the route from Westminster to Tyburn, the tradition is very strong, and it seems always to have been believed that the bodies were brought to Holborn. One possible explanation is that since a gallows stood at the time near the Red Lion Fields, it is not unlikely that there was a misunderstanding as to the gallows on which the bodies were to be exhibited, which resulted in the remains arriving at Red Lion Fields and soon afterwards being taken to Tyburn to be hanged on the famous gallows there. It is by no means unlikely that further desecration of the bodies took place at Red Lion Fields, the site of Red Lion Square. Those who have seen these ghosts say that they walk free abreast and appear to be in deep conversation with each other. They ignore the present paths, roadways and railings and walk in a straight line diagonally across the old area of the square, from south to north. Historian Sir John Prestwick states that Cromwell's remains were privately interred in a small paddock near Holborn, on the spot where the obelisk in Red Lion Square lately stood. Other authorities assert that the bodies of Cromwell, Ireton and Bradshaw were lodged at the old Red Lion Inn at Holborn before being dragged on sledges next day to Tyburn. A number of the older houses in the square were haunted within living memory. One was the scene of a murder, and thereafter the murdered woman's ghost was sometimes seen on spring mornings in the vicinity of the hall and stairway. The murder took place one April morning. The house next door had haunted rooms at the top of the property, and a former occupant told me of distinct footsteps that were often to be heard approaching one of the doors, although nothing was ever seen. Other people in the house maintain that they frequently saw the ghost of an elderly man in the lower part of the premises. Mrs. P. Fitzgerald, the artist of Worthing, Sussex, once had a studio in Red Lion Square, in a house owned by Dr. Josiah Oldfield. One night as she returned to her studio, Mrs. Fitzgerald saw a poorly dressed woman, almost a gypsy, come out of the house, and the strange figure seemed to hiss at the artist as she passed by. "Lady, don't paint the bridge." When Mrs. Fitzgerald turned to reply, there was no sign of the figure, and Dr. Oldfield informed her that he had no knowledge of anyone with such a description, although he seemed reluctant to discuss the matter. A few days later, Mrs. Fitzgerald was asked to paint a roof garden which had a bridge leading from one floor to another, and something, she knew not what, made her refuse the commission. On the day that she would have been working on the painting, the whole bridge and parts of the roof garden collapsed, and it is likely that she would have been killed had she agreed to paint the bridge. Years later, Dr. Oldfield told her that a gypsy, suspected of witchcraft, had been killed by a mob on the premises at the time of the Great Fire of London. In December 1972, my friend Dr. Peter Hilton Rowe was good enough to tell me about yet another haunted house in Red Lion Square, and Mrs. Beryl Sweet Escott of Dedham, Essex, has recounted her experience for me as follows. I have a vivid recollection of an apparition I saw on the staircase of a house in Red Lion Square. I think it was the summer of 1936. At all events, it was a bright and sunny day. A dressmaker who lived on the third floor was making me a garment of some kind. I cannot remember her name, unfortunately, and I had an appointment for a fitting, probably about 3 p.m. I started to climb the stairs, a fine, wide Georgian staircase, uncarpeted, with the unusual twists and turns. At the corner, before reaching the second floor, a charming old gentleman stood back to let me pass. He was white-haired, wore a long blue coat, white breeches and stockings, and buckled shoes. He had what I think was a three-cornered hat under his left arm. He bowed and smiled, and I passed on up the stairs. What is odd to me is that I was neither surprised nor alarmed. He was not, I would say, transparent, but appeared semi-solid, if you know what I mean. In the middle of my fitting, I said to my dressmaker friend, "I thought I saw a ghost on your stairs." "Oh, did you?" she said, mouthful of pins. What did he look like? I described him, and she said matter-of-factly, "Oh yes, we all know him here. We've seen him several times, and we're rather fond of the old boy. He's quite harmless, of course, and always has such nice manners. I never saw any of the other occupants of the house. I have an impression that it was number 10, but I am not sure. The Strand, WC2. Mr. Alan Dent, a well-known theatre and book critic, has related to me his experience of seeing the ghost of Baroness Burdett Coutts in the Strand, just east of Coutts Bank. One sunny June morning during the Second World War, there had been a heavy air raid the night before, and under the clear summer sky, workmen were busy clearing away the rubble and broken glass. Suddenly, Alan Dent noticed an elderly lady walking ahead of him, a somewhat singular figure in Edwardian dress. Black satin, white lace, beneath the bone-supported collarette, a small black and feathery hat, diamond earrings, black shoes, and hands hidden in a dark muff. She was clearly walking and not floating, as many ghosts are traditionally said to do. As he followed the figure, he had the fancy that he had seen her once or twice before, once in Longacre, and another time in Oxford Street, but always from the rear. This time he decided to pass the old lady, and then look back and obtain a full view. As he quickened his steps and passed her, he had a glimpse of a pale complexion and a slight pout, as she continued in an unhurried but purposeful way. Passing Coutts Bank, having been out of sight of the figure for less than 30 seconds, Alan Dent paused at a shop window and then looked round and prepared to walk back the other way he had come, but there was no sign of the old lady. She had completely vanished, and there was no one in front of him for the whole length of the bank. She was not crossing the road, and she was not on the opposite pavement, nor at that moment was there any taxi or car in sight in either direction. Deciding that she must have entered the bank, Alan Dent hurried to the entrance, where a commissionaire was just opening the doors. The time being 10 o'clock, no one had yet entered the bank by the front door. Some days later, Alan Dent happened to describe this strange experience to the landlord of a tavern in Longacre, a shrewd old Welshman named Arthur Powell, who listened carefully to the story and then suggested that the figure sounded like the Baroness Burdett Coutts going into her own bank. He recognised Dent's description, for he had seen the old lady many times, as his father had been one of her coachmen, but she had died 40 years before. Baroness Burdett Coutts was a great friend of Charles Dickens and Henry Irving and the Duke of Wellington, also of Queen Victoria until 1881. Then the 67-year-old Baroness married her former secretary, an American 40 years her junior. Queen Victoria was not abused, rather she was shocked, and she never visited the Baroness again. When Baroness Burdett Coutts died at the age of 92 in 1906, King Edward VII said she was the most remarkable woman in the kingdom, after his mother. The Baroness's family told Alan Dent that her ghost is also reported as having been seen in the East End of London, where the Baroness endowed a market and a block of dwellings in Bethnal Green, and Alan Dent never walks along the Strand without thinking about the Baroness and hoping to see her again. Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. The best known of all theatre ghosts is the man in grey at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. I first heard the story from that great theatre historian W.J. McQueen Pope many years ago, and it was a fascinating account, for Popey told me that he had himself seen the ghost not once but several times. The ghost is a slim figure of a young man dressed in grey. He has a white wig, carries a three-cornered hat, wears riding boots, and has a sword hanging from his waist. One summer afternoon in 1955, Poppy show me the precise track of the ghost. He is first seen occupying the first seat of the fourth row of the upper circle, and then moves across the theatre along the gangway at the back until finally he disappears at the far end into the wall near the royal box. The figure is always seen in daylight between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m, and all witnesses agree on the romantic attire, although some people say that he has powdered hair and he's not wearing a wig, and others report that he is wearing the tricorn hat. Inevitably, no sound accompanies the appearance or movement of the apparition, which walks leisurely and without hurrying, as though he is thoroughly accustomed to the theatre, as indeed he was. Poppy thought that the young man, whose handsome face, with square chin, has been clearly seen so many times, probably had a girlfriend in the theatre in the 18th century. She was possibly a favourite of the theatre manager of the time, and the young man may have been ordered out. Perhaps an argument and a fight followed, and the young man fell, mortally wounded by a stab from a dagger, and the body was hastily walled up in a little passage along which he has walked every night to meet his sweetheart. This theory is based on a discovery in mid-Victorian days, when during structural alterations workmen on the upper circle reported that part of the main wall sounded hollow. When the wall was broken down, a small room or part of a passage was disclosed, and on the floor lay the skeleton of a man with a Cromwellian-style dagger, still embedded between the ribs. A few pieces of cloth were found among the bones, but they crumbled to dust as soon as they were touched. The place where the gruesome discovery was made corresponds exactly with the part of the wall where the ghost is said to disappear. The walls where the skeleton was found were unaltered during the 1796 rebuilding and after the fire of 1809. An inquest followed the discovery, but in the absence of contemporary evidence, an open verdict was returned and no one knows who the victim was or why he was killed. The remains were buried in a little graveyard on the corner of Russell Street and Drury Lane, a place that ceased to be a burial ground in 1853, and is now marked by a small open space and children's playground known as Drury Lane Gardens. It seems indisputable that scores of people have seen this daylight ghost, and Poppy told me that once, during a rehearsal, the ghost walked while over 100 people were on stage, and 70 of them saw it. Poppy himself saw the phantom many times over the years, both before and after the Second World War, and in his history, Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, he writes that he wished to put on record that he has seen the apparition on numerous occasions. Oddly enough, the ghost is regarded as a good omen, for its appearance during rehearsals or during the early days of a run at the Theatre Royal invariably seems to forecast a success for the production. The ghost was reported to have been seen within a few days of the opening night of such successful musicals as Glamorous Night, Careless Rapture, Crest of the Wave, and The Dancing Years. The ghost was not seen before or during the run of Pacific 1860, which turned out to be a failure, but he was seen again just before the successful runs of Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, and My Fair Lady. The Dancing Years was playing the night war broke out, and Ivor Novello called everyone in the half-empty house down into the stalls so that they would be less vulnerable should bombs fall. One did fall in the theatre 3 years later. It landed in the bar where the fire wardens were sleeping, but it failed to explode. The wardens moved out of the room, and 20 minutes later, an incendiary bomb came down through the same hall and set everything alight. People have always been lucky at the Lane. Even the ghost, appearing as it does only between the hours of 10 a.m. and 6 p.m, has never really frightened anyone. One spring morning in 1938, a theatre cleaner was in the upper circle. It was just after 10 a.m, and a rehearsal was in progress. As soon as the cleaner entered the circle, she saw a man dressed in grey and wearing a strange hat, sitting on the end seat of the fourth row, by the centre gangway, gazing down at the stage. She thought that it must be an actor, but decided to make sure, and putting down her pail and broom, she went to speak to the figure. As she drew near, it seemed to melt and had soon disappeared. Then a movement caught her eye near the exit door on the right-hand side of the circle, and she saw the same figure, just as it vanished into solid wall. She said she had never heard of this man in grey, although her description fitted with the first-hand accounts, even to the sword and riding boots. Some years earlier, during a matinee performance, a lady occupying a seat in the upper circle asked an attendant whether actors in the musical came out among the audience. They did not do so in that performance, and the attendant asked the reason for her question. The lady replied that she had noticed a man in a long grey coat with a white wig and three-cornered hat pass through the entrance doors ahead of her. There was no person in the theatre remotely resembling such a description. Over the years, firemen, theatre officials, producers, theatre-goers, visitors and residents have all seen a strikingly similar figure. However, on the one or two occasions that psychic investigators visited the theatre, they had little success. The first occasion was during a period when several people had claimed to see the ghost. The party consisted of 6 people, including Wentworth Day, Harry Price, the noted psychic investigator Jasper Maskelyne of the famous Conjuring family, and McQueen Pope. Suddenly, Wentworth Day's secretary gripped his arm and pointed to the wall where the skeleton was discovered. Wentworth Day told me that he looked immediately and saw a grey-blue, almost luminous light hovering there. Then it moved across the darkness of the royal box. It seemed to move with the odd and uneven action of a man with a limp, and then vanished. A moment later, the same form appeared at the back of the upper circle in mid-air, about 4 feet from the floor. Again it moved unevenly, seeming to have no shape and certainly casting no shadow. Suddenly it was gone. No one else in the party turned quickly enough to see anything. A few years later, another party of celebrities, including Todd Slaughter and Valentine Dial, spent several hours at the theatre and were even less fortunate. None of them heard or saw anything inexplicable. As I relate in my biography of Boris Karloff, during the war, the theatre was taken over by the Entertainment's National Service Association, and in 1942, Stephen Williams, the broadcasting officer, reported that he saw the ghost clearly while he was climbing the grand staircase near the upper circle entrance. The following year, Mrs. R. Hogben, a member of the ENSA headquarters staff, saw the same figure. She was a stranger to London at the time and had never heard of the theatre ghost. The ghost was also seen at this period by stage, radio, film and television actor Henry Oscar, who was director of drama for ENSA during the war. He told me that he was taking his turn at fire watching one night in the huge and empty theatre. Enemy bombers were overheard and Oscar was making his rounds for all parts of the theatre, and he was just crossing the stage when, as his torch beam swept across the corner of the auditorium, he caught sight of a movement and he saw a slim figure coming towards him from about the level of the first box, seemingly suspended in space. There was no doubt at all in my mind that this was the same apparition that habitually haunted the upper circle, he told me. It was certainly no mortal intruder, too shadowy in outline, besides being quite definitely in costume. The riding boots, grey breeches and coat, the ruffled shirt and tricorn hat, even the sword hilt, were all plainly visible in the moment that I saw the figure. Henry Oscar did not stay long enough to watch what happened to the form. He made a hurried exit from the stage, back to the office that served as fire-watching headquarters at the theatre, and during the next round of inspection there was no sign of the mysterious form that he had seen. In 1949, John Ellison, a well-known BBC interviewer, commentator and question master, went to Drury Lane to look for the ghost that had been seen 2 days before. A reporter noticed a distinct psychic tension at the Aldwych end of the upper circle, and one BBC engineer experienced pins and needles, and at the same spot another said he felt as though his hair was trying to stand on end. John Ellison was intrigued, and when he reached that particular place, he noticed a decided chill which he could not account for, and he found that he did not wish to stay in that part of the theatre, which was a spot on the Ghost's Walk. In September 1950, actor Morgan Davies, a leading actor in Carousel, then playing at the theatre, saw the man in grey. At a Saturday matinee performance, the house was full as usual, and Davies' attention was drawn to one empty box. Yet when he looked again, he saw that the box was now occupied by a figure wearing a grey cloak, open at the front to reveal long sleeves with ruffles. The figure stood in the box, swaying slightly, and lifted an arm. Much to his astonishment, Davies found that the arm was transparent, and he could see through it to the door of the box, which was illuminated by a glow of light. Morgan Davies was on stage for 25 minutes in that particular scene, and he estimated that for at least 10 minutes the figure was visible in the box, then it vanished. The only other actor taking part in the scene was facing away from the box in which the figure appeared, and so did not see the strange appearance, although one of the chorus girls said that she too had seen such a figure during another matinee performance. Morgan Davies said at the time he knew nothing of the reputed man in grey. Most recently, Erik Rosenthal, South Africa's walking encyclopedia, told me that he met someone who had seen the ghost at the Theatre Royal, also during matinee performance, and this witness too had never heard of the ghost. The figure was described as greyish in colour, of medium height, long light grey hair under a three-cornered hat, and with an erect posture. The figure disappeared when a member of the audience walked towards it. Some years ago, I learned that the theatre cat, James, would never go near certain parts of the theatre. The cat, docile and friendly enough otherwise, would shriek and nearly go mad if it was carried into the upper circle. 2 of the actors in Gone with the Wind saw the ghost, and Dame Anna Neagle told me in August 1973 that there was a lot of excitement or apprehension during the early run of No No Nanette, when apparently ghostly manifestations were experienced by some of the cast. In his Encyclopedia of London, 1951, William Kent refers to the man in grey in a compact and lucid paragraph. Drury Lane Theatre is the locus of an authenticated haunt. Said to have been seen by hundreds of persons at different times, the spectre, in 18th century costume, emerges from the wall at the left of the circle, and traversing the rear of the seating, enters the opposite wall of the auditorium. Its appearances are frequent but not cyclic. It normally favours matinees or successful productions. Its corpus, together with a dagger, was discovered 103 years ago in a sealed room within the wall from which it walks. It is three-dimensional but not opaque, and becomes imperceptible when approached. The purpose of its preambulations cannot be ascertained, for it does not react in any way to endeavours to communicate. There are other ghosts at the Theatre Royal, as one would expect in such a historic building. The iron foot scraper by the stage door has been worn into a curve by 300 years of use. George II was brought the news of the young pretender's defeat on Culloden Moor whilst watching a play from the royal box, and such memorable actors as Joe Grimaldi, Dan Leno, Mrs. Siddons, Charles Keane, and David Garrick are forever associated with this beautiful theatre. The ghost of actor Charles Macklin, who murdered another actor in the Green Room 200 years ago, has been reported from time to time, stalking across the theatre in front of what used to be the pit. A grand old actor, Macklin, was tall, emaciated, and hatchet-faced, and he had the quick temper of some of his fellow Irishmen. In 1735, during the course of an argument, he thrust his stick at another actor, Thomas Hallam. The stick pierced Hallam's eye, and he died as a result. Yet it is Macklin's ghost that is occasionally seen at the theatre, usually during the early evening, when the tragedy most probably took place. Another ghost at Drury Lane is that of the much-loved comedian Dan Leno, a ghost seen by, among others, comedian Stanley Lupino, father of actress Ida Lupino, has often spoke about the experience to his friends and other comedians, including Arthur Askey, who knew Lupino well. He has told me that he has no doubt that Lupino did have the experience that he describes so vividly. Late one night, after appearing at the theatre in pantomime, Lupino felt too tired to go home, and he lay down on the couch in his dressing room. Almost immediately, he had the feeling that he was not alone in the room, and he heard a sound which he afterwards described as resembling a curtain being drawn aside. Sitting up, he saw the dark form of a man cross the room and pass through a closed door. Puzzled, Lupino sought out the theatre caretaker and learned that no one had been near the dressing room. In fact, there was no one else in the theatre at the time. Back in his room, Lupino again prepared to rest when another noise attracted his attention, this time close beside him. He sat up and saw himself reflected in the make-up mirror, and beside his own face he saw the deathly white but unmistakable features of Dan Leno. Really frightened by now, Lupino sprang up and rushed out of the theatre, and spent the night at the Globe Theatre. He never forgot the experience. He learned afterwards that the room had been the favourite dressing room of Dan Leno, and the last one that he had ever used. Other actors and stagehands have also seen the famous old-time comedian, and not infrequently occupants of that particular dressing room report the rhythmic but quite inexplicable sound of tapping. And McQueen Pope reminded me that Dan Leno was well known for his clog dancing as a young performer. A member of the cast of a Dan Leno pantomime asked once whether she could spend the night alone in his dressing room. Later, she too said that she had seen the ghostly face of Dan Leno and fainted at the sight. McQueen Pope told me about a lady who had written to him after seeing yet another ghost at the Theatre Royal. She attended a matinee performance with her brother and sister, and they had occupied end seats in the dress circle. The informant and her sister noticed a man with very long hair a few seats away in the same row, wearing strangely old-fashioned clothes, almost mid-19th century in appearance. Their brother, to their surprise, said he could not see the man. The play opened, and the attention of all three theatre-goers was centred on the stage. But at the end of the first act, when the lights went up, the ladies were amazed to see that the man was no longer there. Yet his position would have meant that he had to pass them to leave, and certainly no one had disturbed them. Some time later, the same correspondent wrote again to McQueen Pope to say that she had just read his book on the Theatre Royal, and had recognised from a photograph in the book the mysterious person she and her sister had seen. It was undoubtedly Charles Keane, the actor-manager who had loved Drury Lane Theatre and who had died in 1868. Several actresses have felt friendly hands guiding them to the correct position when they have been on the great stage for the first time at the Theatre Royal. In particular, Betty Jo Jones, an American comedienne, told McQueen Pope during the run of Oklahoma that she felt invisible hands helping her. She said she was gently guided to the position downstage, which was greatly advantageous, both to herself and to the production as a whole. The following night she had precisely the same experience. Thereafter, she used the new position, and once, just as she had moved there, she felt a kindly pat on the back. Early in the run of The King and I, singer Doreen Duke had a similar experience, the feeling of two hands on her shoulders guiding her to the right place at the right time. and occasionally she too felt an invisible pat of encouragement. Like Betty Jo Jones, she was certain that the help she had had at Drury Lane Theatre was not of this world, and there is a man who swears that one summer afternoon in 1948 he saw the forms of King Charles II and a crowd of his gaily dressed courtiers pass down the side gangway of the stalls, mount the stage and disappear amongst the company of Oklahoma